America wasn't ready. It wasn't ready for a woman to sit on national television and speak openly, even proudly, about the men she had loved. It wasn't ready for a black comedian to address race without softening the truth to protect white comfort. And it certainly wasn't ready for someone to stand on live television and suggest that the very language America used, the words chosen by politicians, broadcasters, and institutions, had been carefully designed to hide reality rather than reveal it. Network television in the 1970s was not a confession booth. It was a controlled environment built on tone, timing, and containment. There were rules, spoken and unspoken, that every guest understood before stepping onto that stage. Promote your latest project. Tell a safe anecdote. Laugh at Johnny's jokes. Maintain the illusion. And whatever you do, save the real dirt for after the cameras stopped rolling. Because this wasn't cable. There was no streaming platform, no podcast circuit, no second take. There was only network television, and network television answered to advertisers, sponsors, and the Federal Communications Commission. At the center of that carefully managed universe sat Johnny Carson, the master of late-night decorum, a host whose greatest skill was not just getting people to talk, but knowing exactly when to stop them. He could redirect a dangerous answer with a raised eyebrow, dissolve tension with a well-timed laugh, or cut to commercial before a conversation crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For millions of Americans, Carson represented stability, safety, control. But there were nights when even he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. There were moments when the studio audience didn't know whether to laugh or sit in stunned silence. Moments when Carson glanced down at his desk, not because he had run out of questions, but because the answer he had just heard could not be taken back. These guests weren't reckless. They weren't simply unfiltered, and they weren't chasing cheap shock value. They were doing something far more unsettling. They were telling the truth. And on live network television, truth is far more dangerous than scandal. Scandal can be managed. Publicists can spin it. Networks can soften it, reframe it, or quietly bury it. But truth, especially when spoken without apology, without embarrassment, without hesitation, cannot be edited once it leaves someone's mouth. So the real question is not whether America was ready. The real question is this: when the emotional dam breaks on live television, and the illusion of control cracks in front of millions of viewers, who pays the price? When Shelley Winters sat down on Johnny Carson's couch, she didn't flirt, she didn't tease, she didn't hint, she confessed. Long before celebrity memoirs turned into multi-million-dollar exposés, Winters treated late-night television as if it were her own personal confessional booth. She spoke about Hollywood the way most people speak about their hometown, casually, intimately, and without the protective layer of studio-approved modesty. And when she began naming names, the room shifted. Winters openly discussed her romantic history, including her relationship with Marlon Brando, confirming rumors that had floated around Hollywood for years but had never been validated on national television. She delivered it all with a kind of unapologetic amusement, even wordplay. "Some stars acted," she once quipped. "I acted up in their beds." It wasn't the explicitness alone that unsettled viewers. It was the absence of shame. In an era when male stars were quietly celebrated for their conquests while women were expected to maintain at least the illusion of modesty, Winters refused to perform embarrassment. Carson laughed, but his laughter carried tension. He widened his eyes, leaned back slightly, occasionally tried to pivot the conversation to safer territory. He understood the game. This was network television. Advertisers were watching. Executives were watching. The FCC was always in the background. But Winters didn't seem concerned about containment. She spoke as if the consequences were secondary to the story itself. Behind the scenes, reactions were mixed. Some insiders admired her candor. Others accused her of exaggeration, suggesting she was mythologizing her own past to remain relevant in an industry that often discards women as they age. A few actresses quietly resented her, arguing that she was dismantling what little dignity Hollywood still maintained. Was she liberating the narrative of female sexuality, or was she turning confession into branding? Was this honesty, or was it self-advertisement wrapped in rebellion? What made Winters truly disruptive wasn't simply that she had lived boldly, it was that she claimed ownership of those experiences publicly. She did not frame her romantic history as regret, trauma, or victimhood. She framed it as life, as choice, as something she remembered with amusement rather than apology. And in doing so, she challenged a deeply rooted cultural double standard that men could recount desire with pride, while women must either deny it or pay for it. On a show built on control and decorum, Winters introduced something far more volatile: narrative autonomy. She was not waiting for the industry to tell her story. She was telling it herself, live, without rehearsal, without protective spin. And once spoken aloud on network television, those stories could not be pulled back. The audience laughed. But beneath the laughter was a subtle discomfort. Because the real shock wasn't what Shelley Winters had done, it was that she refused to pretend she hadn't done it. And perhaps that is the question that lingered long after the applause faded. When a woman refuses to apologize for her past on national television, is she breaking rules? Or exposing the fact that the rules were never fair to begin with? George Carlin didn't need to shout to make people nervous. He only needed to define a word. When he stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage, he wasn't there to confess scandal or shock through behavior. He arrived with something far more destabilizing: linguistic precision. His most famous routine, 7 words you can never say on television, wasn't just about profanity, it was about authority. There are no bad words, Carlin argued. Bad thoughts, bad intentions, and words. The implication was subtle but explosive. If words themselves aren't immoral, then censorship is not about morality, it's about control. And that idea didn't stay theoretical, it became legal history. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in FCC v. Pacifica Foundation, a case directly triggered by a radio broadcast of Carlin's routine. Suddenly, his comedy wasn't just edgy, it was constitutional territory. So when he appeared on Carson afterward, everyone in that studio knew the stakes. This wasn't just a comic testing boundaries, this was a man whose words had already forced the government to respond. But Carlin's sharpest material wasn't always the explicit stuff, it was his dissection of euphemism. Shell shock, he once explained, was a phrase that sounded human, honest, raw. But by the time it became post-traumatic stress disorder, the pain felt distant, clinical, sanitized. "We don't have shell shock anymore," Carlin said. "We have post-traumatic stress disorder." 4 syllables replaced 2, and somehow the horror sounded manageable. He did the same with war. "The CIA doesn't kill people," he joked darkly. "They neutralize targets." Civilian deaths weren't deaths, they were collateral damage. Each phrase removed emotional weight. Each phrase created distance between action and consequence. And here's what made that dangerous on network television. He wasn't just criticizing politicians, he was criticizing language, the very tool media relied on to shape public perception. Carson often smiled through these segments, occasionally nodding in admiration. But there were moments, small ones, when he leaned back slightly, hands folded, letting Carlin finish a thought that edged close to systemic critique. Because if language manipulation exists in government, does it exist in television? Does it exist in advertising? In headlines? In the introduction of guests? Was Carlin just doing comedy, or was he gently accusing the entire broadcast structure of complicity? He once said, "I'm not into censorship, I'm into telling the truth." And that truth was this: sanitizing language doesn't sanitize reality, it only hides it. The studio audience laughed. They always laughed. But sometimes there was that half-second pause after a punchline, the kind of pause that happens when people realize they weren't just laughing at a joke, they were laughing at themselves. Because if words are weapons, then who holds them? And if a comedian can expose how language disguises violence, does that make him a performer or a threat? Joan Rivers didn't just push boundaries, she built a career on walking straight through them. For years, she was Johnny Carson's golden protégé. Carson had discovered her, nurtured her, invited her back again and again. He trusted her timing, he admired her bite, and audiences loved the electricity she brought to the couch. But Rivers didn't whisper gossip, she weaponized it. On The Tonight Show, she openly joked about plastic surgery long before celebrities admitted to it. "I've had so much plastic surgery," she once said, "that when I die, they'll donate my body to Tupperware." The audience roared. But beneath the punchline was a confession no one else was making publicly at the time. In an era where image was everything and denial was policy, Rivers didn't deny. She exaggerated. She owned it. She also named names. While other comedians hinted, Rivers specified. Cheating actors. Fake marriages arranged by studios. Stars who privately behaved nothing like their public personas. "You think your favorite leading man is faithful?" She would smirk. "Honey, I've seen more loyalty in a dog pound." It was funny, but it wasn't abstract. Industry insiders knew exactly who she was talking about. And that was the problem. Hollywood operates on mutual protection. Unwritten agreements. Publicists smooth things over. Studios bury stories, but Rivers pulled back the curtain live on national television. Not in memoir form years later, but in the moment. Carson sometimes laughed, sometimes stiffened, sometimes tried to redirect, because the more specific she became, the harder it was to pretend it was just comedy. But the real rupture didn't happen on air. It happened when Rivers accepted an offer from Fox in 1986 to host her own late-night show directly competing with Carson. She didn't tell him beforehand. And Carson never forgave her, not for leaving, but for not calling. In later interviews, Rivers insisted she had tried to reach him, that she had called, that he refused to take the call. Others claim Carson felt betrayed not professionally, but personally. In his mind, she had broken loyalty. In her mind, she had claimed independence. Was she disloyal, or was she simply tired of waiting for permission? The industry reaction was brutal. Carson reportedly banned her from The Tonight Show. Doors quietly closed. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who produced her Fox show, later died by suicide amid the program's failure. Rivers' career stalled for years. And in a business built on momentum, stall can feel like exile. Was that exile punishment? Or coincidence? What made Rivers too honest wasn't just her jokes. It was her refusal to pretend she didn't want power. She didn't want to be the permanent guest. She wanted the chair, the desk, the control. And in the male-dominated ecosystem of late-night television in the 1980s, that ambition was more threatening than any punchline about plastic surgery. The audience laughed when she confessed. They laughed when she named names. But the real shock wasn't what she said. It was what she did. Because sometimes, the most dangerous honesty isn't about sex, scandal, or gossip. It's about ambition. And when a woman admits she wants the throne instead of laughing beside it, does the empire collapse? Or does it push back? Zsa Zsa Gabor didn't confess. She performed. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, she didn't sit politely and answer questions. She floated. She flirted. She leaned in too close. She touched Johnny Carson's arm as if the show were merely a private cocktail party and the cameras were an afterthought. In a studio governed by unspoken rules of restraint, she behaved as though none of them applied to her. And perhaps, in her mind, they didn't. Zsa Zsa openly discussed her 9 husbands, sometimes correcting interviewers who understated the number. "They wanted me to have a butcher as my 8th husband," she once joked. If the butcher is sexy and exciting, why not? The line was playful, but the subtext was unmistakable. She did not apologize for desire. She did not disguise her romantic history. She treated it as resume material. American television in the 1970s still operated under a puritanical shadow. Married couples had once slept in separate beds on sitcoms. Sexual innuendo had to be disguised as metaphor. But Zsa Zsa brought European frankness, or at least the performance of it. She spoke of love, lovers, and marriage with theatrical pride, not defensive explanation. She flirted with Carson on air. She teased him about his big microphone. She turned suggestive language into sport. The audience laughed, but there was always that edge of uncertainty. Was this scripted banter? Or was she genuinely destabilizing the polite distance between host and guest? Backstage stories only fueled the myth. It was said she once slapped another guest before going on, that she could switch from charm to confrontation in seconds. Whether exaggerated or not, those rumors traveled. They amplified her persona. Unpredictable, unfiltered, untamed. But here's what made her dangerous in a subtler way. Zsa Zsa didn't present sexuality as confession. She presented it as power. She was not ashamed of aging, not ashamed of multiple marriages, not ashamed of wanting admiration. In a culture that quietly encouraged women past a certain age to soften, retreat, or downplay their desirability, she did the opposite. She amplified it. Was she liberated? Or was she commodifying herself in a system that already objectified women? Because that tension sat underneath every laugh. The glamorous European socialite who didn't understand American modesty. The woman who spoke too openly but did so in diamonds and couture. She wasn't asking permission. She was announcing presence. Carson often appeared amused, sometimes slightly flustered, but rarely confrontational. He understood something critical. Gabor wasn't simply crossing lines, she was turning the lines into stage props. The show didn't lose control. It shifted tone. But what happens when scandal becomes performance? When honesty becomes spectacle? When a woman declares her romantic history as triumph instead of transgression? The audience laughed at the flirtation. They applauded the glamour. But beneath the sparkle was a deeper rupture. Because in a society that tolerates male excess but polices female appetite, Zsa Zsa Gabor did something quietly radical. She refused to shrink. And when a woman refuses to shrink on national television, does the audience celebrate her or secretly hope she stumbles? Red Fox didn't whisper his truth. He delivered it the way he always had: direct, rhythmic, unapologetic. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show, Foxx was already a legend in black comedy circles. His nightclub routines and party records were famously explicit, sold under the counter, passed around privately, rarely acknowledged in mainstream white media. Network television had long required black performers to soften themselves to be charming, palatable, non-threatening, but Foxx didn't fully adjust the temperature when he stepped onto Carson's stage. He told sex jokes that made executives tense. He spoke about interracial relationships in ways that forced the audience to confront taboos rather than laugh comfortably around them. At one point, he joked, "I've had more white women than Johnny's had monologues." It was a punchline, but it was also layered commentary on power, on race, on who gets to boast publicly and who gets labeled dangerous for doing so. The audience reaction was often split-second confusion followed by laughter, the kind of laughter that arrives because silence feels riskier. You could hear it. Gasps, nervous chuckles, applause that came a beat too late. Carson sometimes flushed slightly, shifting in his chair, smiling tightly before steering the moment back into safer waters. But here's what made Foxx different. He didn't switch personas for white television. He didn't translate himself entirely. Many black performers of the era maintained two modes, one for mainstream audiences, one for black audiences. Foxx blurred that line. He brought nightclub cadence into network space. He brought racial candor into living rooms that were not accustomed to hearing it without filter. And that was radical. He joked about police harassment, about racial double standards, about the absurdity of a country that consumed black culture while marginalizing black people. The Tonight Show wasn't built for that kind of conversation. It was built for containment, for laughter without discomfort, for unity through avoidance. Was Foxx pushing boundaries for shock value, or was he simply refusing to dilute himself for white comfort? Because in a television landscape that largely excluded authentic black perspectives, Foxx wasn't just being funny, he was being visible, unedited, and visibility without permission can feel threatening. Carson walked a careful line. He respected Foxx. He invited him back. But you could sense the navigation, the quick pivot after a particularly sharp line, the redirect towards safer anecdote, not censorship, not confrontation, just calibration. Foxx once said, "You booked me. You knew what you were getting." And that may have been the quiet truth of it. The producers knew. Carson knew. The audience may not have. What made Foxx too honest wasn't vulgarity. It was refusal. refusal to compartmentalize, refusal to perform comfort, refusal to let racial reality remain an off-limit subject in a country built on it. The laughter came, but so did the tension, and the lingering question wasn't about whether his jokes went too far. It was this: when a black man speaks openly about race on live television and doesn't soften the edges, is he breaking decorum or breaking illusion? Oliver Reed didn't dismantle language. He didn't expose industry secrets. He didn't reframe racial discourse. He destabilized the room. The British actor was already infamous long before stepping onto Johnny Carson's stage. Stories of heavy drinking, brawls in pubs, unpredictable behavior on film sets. Reed carried a reputation that preceded him. But American network television was not a London pub. It was structured, rehearsed, contained, and Reed did not adapt to containment. On The Tonight Show, he appeared visibly intoxicated, not playfully tipsy, genuinely unfiltered. He interrupted. He leaned too close to other guests. He flirted aggressively. He rambled about orgies in London as though discussing weekend weather. The laughter from the audience came in waves, sometimes genuine, sometimes uneasy. Carson's task shifted from interviewer to stabilizer. He smiled tightly. He attempted redirection. He inserted humor as a buffer between Reed and escalation. But this wasn't simply about inappropriate words. It was about unpredictability. Reed didn't seem interested in preserving decorum. He treated the stage as another arena for authenticity, even if that authenticity veered toward volatility. At one point, he challenged Carson to a physical contest on-air half-joke, half-dare. The moment carried a strange electricity. The audience laughed, but there was tension underneath. Live television has no safety net. There are no edits. If something truly erupts, millions witness it in real time. Backstage stories amplified the legend. It was said that Shelley Winters once threw a drink in his face. That producers quietly panicked. That staff hovered closer than usual during his segments. Whether embellished or not, those accounts shaped the narrative. Reed wasn't just provocative, he was combustible. But here's what makes his case different from the others. Shelley Winters challenged gender norms. George Carlin challenged language. Joan Rivers challenged power. Red Foxx challenged racial illusion. Oliver Reed challenged control itself. Television relies on the illusion that everything unfolding is managed, that chaos is scripted, that risk is contained within predictable limits. Reed exposed how fragile that illusion was. He reminded viewers that live television involves actual humans, and actual humans are not always safe. Was he being authentic or reckless? Was his lack of self-censorship courage, or simply self-destruction? Because there's a fine line between honesty and instability, between truth and loss of restraint. And Reed walked that line visibly, unapologetically, sometimes clumsily. The audience laughed. They always laughed. But they also leaned forward. Because when a guest might genuinely go off the rails, the show transforms. It stops being controlled entertainment and starts feeling like live theater, unpredictable, slightly dangerous, real. And perhaps that's the final question this list leaves us with. When truth spills out on television, it disrupts narrative. But when unpredictability enters the room, it disrupts power. And which one is network television more afraid of? America thought it was watching a talk show, a safe space, a polished ritual, a place where laughter stayed harmless and truth stayed controlled. But every so often, something slipped through the cracks. Shelley Winters refused shame. George Carlin questioned the words America hid behind. Joan Rivers dared to want power. Zsa Zsa Gabor refused to shrink. Red Foxx spoke race without softening it. Oliver Reed reminded everyone that live television is only ever one unpredictable moment away from chaos. They weren't reckless, they were honest. And honesty, when it isn't filtered or negotiated, doesn't just entertain, it exposes. Maybe America wasn't ready. Or maybe it was ready, just not comfortable. So here's the real question. When the mask slips on live television, do we blame the guest or do we finally see the system? If you think late night was ever just comedy, think again. Subscribe for more stories Hollywood didn't plan to tell.